A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Schabes at the Skizar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been generously sponsored anonymously in remembrance of everything that was lost in Europe during the years of the war and the Holocaust. In this episode, which is going to start to profile lesser-known Chassidic dynasties, which for the most part, many of them are lesser known because they were completely wiped out during the war, is appropriate now for this season, this time of year, the 9 days coming up to Tisha B'Av. And since this week is going to be Tisha B'Av, so we're going to try to have an appropriate episode later on this week to fit into that atmosphere. And if you'd like to have that sponsored, a topic of that sort sponsored or an idea, then please be in touch with me about that. Speaking of sponsorships, we got a lot of great feedback on the Detroit episode in the Jewish History City series of Jewish History Soundbites. We had Detroit Part 1, and a lot of great feedback, a lot of good stories and news sources, and some people, some old-timers who offered a lot of anecdotes and personalities from the history of Jewish Detroit. So we're looking forward to a part 2, and it is still available for sponsorship. So if you'd like to sponsor that as well, you can be in touch with me, yehuda@yehudageber.com. So looking forward to a Tisha B'Av episode and a Detroit part 2, and many other exciting and great topics following Tisha B'Av and over the summer. It's going to be some interesting stories. So getting back to the story of lesser-known Chassidic dynasties. What does it mean that it's lesser known? Why is it lesser known? Does it mean that it was very, very small and had very little impact, and that's why it was lesser known? Or is there other reasons that it was lesser known? It wasn't so well known. Perhaps it was well known and it was very large, but it was so completely wiped out in the Holocaust that it only later on became less well known. So that's the questions you want to ask. Sometimes there's even very large ones that today are, I wouldn't say they're unknown. Again, I'm very particular what I'm saying now. I'm not saying they're unknown, because as soon as you say unknown, then all of a sudden you get people, what are you, unknown? I know about it. Everyone knows about it. What are you talking about? There's a shtibel down the block from me where I daven all the time that's named after this dynasty. So we're not saying unknown. We're talking about less well-known than others, sometimes because they were always small and had very little impact. Sometimes they were at one point larger and they were just completely exterminated, wiped out, hard hit during the war. Some of those were some of the largest ones in Poland before the war. Of course, Radomsk, which I had an episode on, Alexander, which arguably may have been the largest Chassidic dynasty in the world. It's up there with Ger. Ger was, of course, till today is very prominent. Before the war in Poland, there was Ger, Alexander. Radomsk wasn't far behind, and we've all heard of Ger, and the other two are much less well known. In Galicia, you had different branches of the Rizhin dynasty, like Chortkiv and Husiatin, which, again, the names might be familiar, but they were very, very large and prominent and influential, had a huge impact with Shtiblach all over. very famous rebbes at times, and big courts, centers of pilgrimage, and yet today Husiatin is pretty much non-existent. The dynasty ended in the 1950s. Charkiv is almost, have a little bit shtibel here and there, a few Hasidim here and there, but nothing like it used to be. So we see the destruction that was done by the Holocaust, and they're unable to, in different branches of the Tzan's dynasty, different branches of the Rupshitz Jikov dynasty. Melitz was quite large before the war and is almost non-existent today. Even though the Melitz Rebbe was the one who said recited the Tehillim at Lincoln Memorial by the Rabbis' March in October 1943, but still the Melitz Chassidic dynasty is not that prominent anymore like it used to be in pre-war Galicia. So this is something to explore. This is something that could essentially we could be launching a series. I didn't have that in mind when I started, but I had in mind something more just in the spirit of the 9 days in Tisha B'Av to speak about the forgotten and the lesser known Chassidic dynasties that either no longer exist altogether or are much smaller than they used to be. But it, in theory, could be a series, something to talk about, all different ones that we could remember and are part of history. So perhaps we'll explore this topic further at further opportunity. If you have your favorite lesser-known dynasty that you want profiled here, then you definitely can be in touch with me about that, to have that sponsored as well. When I was preparing this, a very prominent and knowledgeable and dedicated listener of Jewish History Soundbites, I was discussing with him about this topic that I'm working on, and we're going to have an episode soon. And he says to me, I know of a minion factory in Muncie called Dombrova. Is that a forgotten Chassidic dynasty, or is it just a minion factory that they found a convenient name for? Or is it a lesser-known dynasty? What is that? And I think that's a perfect example. If we just talk about Dombrova for a second. I mean, it was started by Rav Menachem David Ungar, who was a student of the Noam Elimelech, the Rebbe Melech of Lezhensk, the Chayza of Lublin, the Kuznetzer Magid. So again, this places him relatively early on in the Hasidic movement. He then goes on to found the Dombrova dynasty, when he became a Chassidic leader in his own right in that town, the town of Dombrova in Galicia, until his passing in 1833. And then he's followed by his son, Rabbi Yosef Ungar, and then his grandson, Rabbi Yisrael Elimelech Ungar. And at this point, the court moves to a nearby town, Jebna, another Galicia town. And this, over the generations, they're related to all kinds of neighboring dynasties, the Kuznets, the Jikov, the Tzans, and they are very prominent in the center of Galicia, the Galicia influence. In general, when we talk about lesser-known dynasties, many of them were in Galicia, because Galicia was the most crowded area of Hasidus. The most splits among sons in succession, not in a dispute way, just the different sons or sons-in-law of the previous leader of the dynasty would go to different towns, and they would establish their own small courts. And most courts in Galicia, there was always, of course, there were big prominent ones like Belz and Tzans and later Bobov and Charkiv, and others. But many of them were very small, kind of like intimate. There was a very closeness with many of these rebbes and their Hasidim. They had a very limited geographical influence, and they liked it that way, that they had this relationship with their followers. And Galicia, in particular, was the most crowded area of the ratio between Hasidic leaders, tzaddikim, and followers. More than Ukraine, more than Hungary, more than Romania, more than Congress Poland, more than Russia, more than Belarus, more than Lithuania. Galicia was much more crowded, dense, with leaders and dynasties and splits and new dynasties sprouting up. So this Dombrova dynasty continues with several branches until it's almost entirely wiped out in the Holocaust. Almost all of the branches and almost them are almost entirely wiped out. One of the prominent descendants who did survive was a fellow by the name of Menashe Ungar. So he's the direct, Ben Achar Ben, a direct male descendant of the dynasty, who was the editor of the Morgan Journal in New York, and he was the author of many great works on the Chassidic movement and the Holocaust. He wrote a fantastic book about Chassidic leaders murdered in the Holocaust, which is kind of related to this topic. Other prominent members who married female descendants of the dynasty include the Bostoner Rebbe, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Horowitz of the Bostoner Rebbe, who married a Dombrova descendant, Rabbi Yisrael Spira, the Bluzhever Rebbe, the Holocaust survivor, famous, great tzaddik, a fascinating person. So his first wife, who was killed in the Holocaust, was also a Dombrova descendant. But the most prominent descendant came from an entirely different branch of the Dombrova dynasty. A great-grandson of this aforementioned Rabbi Yisrael Elimelech was a fellow by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak Ungar, and he immigrated to the United States and was a rabbi in Crown Heights. And he called himself the Dombrova Rebbe. And his son, Rav Mordechai David Ungar, who's, of course, named for someone who was the founder of this dynasty, who I mentioned earlier, is today the current Baba of a Rebbe, what's known as the Baba of Rebbe 45 or 45th, or whatever it's called. So it all comes around that way, that it goes back to being a leader of a prominent Galicia Hasidus, just not of the original Dombrova one, but of another one, Babov. So there you have it, that the Dombrova descendant becomes the Baba of a Rebbe, at least of one of the factions. So another descendant, interestingly enough, of that dynasty was a fellow by the name of Rabbi Yisrocher Beresh Rubin, who ended up in Berlin around the time of World War I, and he was the Dombrova Rebbe of Berlin, of all places. And for understandable reasons, he moves eventually to New York, and his grandson in Muncie is the one who was referred to by the listener that I mentioned earlier, that he has what he called the Minion Factory in Muncie. So just as an example, each one of these small and not so famous dynasties is a whole story, and had a contribution and an impact on the world stage, and is part of Jewish history, and they have what to say, and their story is a story that's waiting to be told. And most of them, like I said, and I'm going to continue to say, were completely or almost entirely wiped out during the Holocaust. So while in Europe they may have been small, and they may have been less influential than Ger or Lubavitch or Belz or some of the more famous dynasties like that, may have had less of an influence even then, but they were there, and they still existed. They still existed as a small community with whatever impact they had. But as a result of the Holocaust, some of them have been erased forever. So at least some of their stories can be told here, and the spiritual legacy that they left can live on among the Jewish people through our getting to know their stories and what their contribution was. And they were all over. These type of dynasties were all over. There are some examples just from Poland. There was the Lomage. Again, these are picked out of a hat. And there's literally 1,000 names I could have chosen from, and I hope to get to over if we actually do a series like this and profile some of the other lesser known ones. But Lomage was a grandson of the Kotzker, and the son of the Kotzker, Rav David Morgenstern, had a son who was in Lomage. He was the Lomage Kotzker Rebbe, and he's buried in Warsaw, and that was a branch of the Kotzker dynasty. Skernowicz was actually quite large in Poland before the war, and it was near Warsaw, so it had a prominence. It was a player on the Jewish scene, and most of us would never have even heard of Skernowicz if not for the fact that Rabbi Yitzchak Gerstenkorn, who was the one who founded Bnei Brak and was its first mayor, was a Skernowicz Chassid. So they made an imprint on the Israel scene, so therefore the name Skernowicz isn't lost to oblivion. But it was quite a significant Chassidic dynasty in Poland before the war. Jablona would have been entirely forgotten, even though it was a branch of Kazmir related to Muzhitz. But then this story about one of the rebbes of that dynasty was just made famous a few years ago by Rabbi Penny Dunner. About he was a rebbe who left not just his Chassidim, not just his followers, not just the way of the Chassidic world, but left Judaism entirely, and became a fascinating story. Ended up in LA, and of course you can listen to him say it. He says it better than I do. We would never have heard of the dynasty otherwise. And this was again had significant following in Poland. There is examples from Galicia. There was the Ruzla Chassidic Dynasty, which is a branch of Zidichov. There's offshoots of Tzanz, there's offshoots of Jikov, there's branches of Belz. There's other smaller names that nobody ever heard of, or very few people have heard of. Let me correct myself again before I get yelled at. There's Linsk and Barnov and Drohobovich. And, one of the Tzanz branches was actually quite large. The Kshanov branch from Tzanz was at one time very prominent. Today, almost non-existent. There was the Galina Zebrov. Again, another Tzanz branch that was prominent back in the day. Shinov. Reb Chatzkel of Shinov was the oldest son of the Tzanzer, and his descendants continue the Shinov dynasty. Again, today, almost non-existent. Strizov, which was a branch of Melitz, and many more. In Ukraine, you had all kinds of ones, again, small, lesser-known branches. There was, for example, Shpikov, which is a branch of Skver, which came from the Chernobyl dynasty. It was also related to Rizhin. It was wiped out entirely, not only because of the Holocaust, but also because they're in Ukraine, also as a result of communism. And they were behind the Iron Curtain already before the war. They had one famous descendant, otherwise no one would have ever heard of Shpikov, and his name was Rav Menachem Mendel Hager, who was the son-in-law of the Belzer Rebbe, Rabbi Sacher Daiv. And the reason he became famous is because Professor David Asaf published a very fascinating confession of this fellow, who on the eve of his wedding wrote this confession to the Yiddish writer Yaakov Denizen in Warsaw about his misgivings, about his lifestyle, about Hasidism in general, about Belz, about his marriage, and he stayed within the Hasidic movement. He didn't leave. He had this confession, he had his issues, he had these misgivings, but he stayed there. He became the rabbi in Rava-Ruska, near Belz, and he and his entire family were killed in Belzhitz during the Holocaust. But again, that was another branch of the Hasidic movement that was almost entirely disappeared. Vasli was a Rizhin branch that almost disappeared. Stretton was a Chassidic dynasty. Rabbi Yehuda Tzvi Brandwein, a student of Reb Uri of Strelisk. And later on, the Langer brothers, who were one of the first rebbes to come to the United States. That's another dynasty. There's the Savran, a Chassidic dynasty from the Ukraine, that the only reason they're famous today is because they had a dispute with Breslov during the early 1800s with Reb Nosson of Nemirov. So that's the way they achieved fame. So the only reason we even know the name Savran today, Rabbi Shatsuyu Savran, and it continued. The Savran dynasty continued for many, many years. And more. Alec Stefanesh is a famous branch of Rizhin. It was a major Hasidic group in Romania, and which had thousands of followers. Today it's just seen as a skula and a gravesite to pray at in Tel Aviv. I was just there on Friday with my kids. But it actually was a major dynasty in Romania before the war. So the list goes on and on. I want to choose one to zoom in on to make it more interesting instead of just throwing out names and confusing people. But I hope to get to more of them over time. I want to zoom in and profile this time one specific dynasty, the Zabeltov dynasty, which is a branch of Kossov related to Vizhnitz. Kossov Vizhnitz, which had a huge impact and very influential in Eastern Galicia, Bukovina, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, the famous Hager or Hager family. Their fame is achieved and sustained until today because Vizhnitz is still, in the Jewish world today, very large, very prominent, and very influential, both in Israel and the United States. And therefore, the Kossov Vizhnitz still remains alive and well and healthy and rebuilt. But if we talk a little bit about some of the other branches of this dynasty that disappeared, so it's one of the oldest also. It starts pretty much from the Baal Shem Tov himself. It's very, very old, very, very from the beginning of the Chassidic movement. The Baal Shem Tov had a student named Reb Yaakov Kapel Chassid, and his son was Rav Menachem Mendel Hager of Kossov. He started the Kossov dynasty. He was born in Kolomea, which is the Baal Shem Tov territory, and he was a student of some of the early great tzaddikim in that area of Ukraine, including possibly Rav Moshe Leib of Sassov, who was a fascinating personality in the early part of the Chassidic movement. Primarily, this Rav Menachem Mendel Hager was a student of Rav Tzvi Hirsch of Nadvarna, early tzaddik of the Nadvarna dynasty. And at first, initially, Rav Menachem Mendel of Kossov was in business, a businessman. It was not so successful. He lived very simply. As his teachers either passed away or moved to the land of Israel, he eventually started to attract a following in Kossov and in that area. And it's actually in a strategic location because Kossov is near the borders of Czechia, which is Czechoslovakia, the area of Carpato Rus, and Hungary. It's right near there, and it's basically in Bukovina. Today it's in Ukraine, but the area of Bukovina. So he was a very impressive, very, very impressive individual, very charismatic, and he attracted a significant following, and he launches the Kossov Dynasty, which continues with his descendants down to this very day. His grandchild and namesake, Rav Menachem Mendel Hager, again, was the founder of the Vizhnitz dynasty, and that became the largest and most prestigious branch of Kossov, already before the war. Presumably because of its relation to Rizhin, to the Rizhiner, and which increased its influence and prominence, and also it adopted some of the trappings of Rizhin, which increased its influence over in that area, and tremendous, large and influential in Bukovina, in Romania, before the war. And especially after the war, the Imre Chaim of Vizhnitz was one of the heroes of post-war rebuilding of Jewish life in Israel, and later on through his children in the United States and in Israel. However, this original Rav Menachem Mendel of Kossov had another son, and his name was Rav Dovid Hager. And Rav Dovid Hager moved to the town of Zabeltov, and he was a prominent Chassidic leader there, as well as the founding of a dynasty named after the town where he was, that lasted generations, all the way down to the war, all the way down to the Holocaust. And at times had significant numbers and influence. Again, Zabeltov is something that is almost completely unknown today. And this has existed for a long, long time, for 150 years. And it was at times quite large and very influential, and had some very, very impressive people who headed it, who led it, and came from it. And there's something that was completely wiped out and forgotten almost. This Rav Dovid of Zabeltov was a son-in-law of Rav Moshe Leib of Sassov, who I mentioned, was one of the most fascinating characters in the annals of the Chassidic movement, and also very early on. And some of the, when we talk about, in general, this topic that I introduced of lesser-known dynasties, many of them were offshoots of existing ones, of more famous ones that only were around for a generation or two before the war. They came much later on. They were around for a generation or two before the war, and then they were wiped out. So it's more understandable why those are not so well known. But Zabeltov, this comes from almost the beginning. This did not show up on the Jewish scene in the beginning of the 20th century by some, by a small offshoot. This is around from the start, pretty much. It started even before Vizhnitz, for its more famous relative, right? So when Rav Menachem Mendel of Kossov passed away in 1825, and Rav Dovid's older brother succeeded the father in Kossov, so Rav Dovid, becomes known as the Chassidic tzaddik in Zabeltov. And he was also, however, interesting with him is that he was also the rabbi of the town. So he was the rabbi, the communal rabbi of the town, a prominent Talmud Chacham, a great Torah scholar as well. And he, in addition to becoming his position as rabbi, he was also the Chassidic tzaddik. So he was renowned in the area of the whole region, the whole area of Galicia, and beyond for his wisdom, his sage advice. Some of the greatest Chassidic leaders of his day saw him as a wise man, as someone who they would seek out advice from. The Divrei Chaim of Tzanz used to call him Chacham Adif Minavi, the wise man who is better than a prophet. That's how he referred to Rav Dovid Hager of Zabeltov. The Rizhiner, the Heilige Rizhiner, Rabbi Yisrael Friedman of Rizhin, used to call Rav Dovid of Zabeltov the wise man of the world, the Chacham Ha'olam, the wise man of the world, and other Chassidic leaders as well. As was customary by his father, and what would also become a hallmark of the Kossov dynasty in general, in all its branches, in Vizhnitz and everywhere else. Rav Dovid Hager was very generous with his charitable projects. He would literally distribute everything he had to people in need. Became a hallmark of him as a personality, of his descendants, of the other branches of the dynasty as well. Interesting that his wife, Rebbetzin Pesialea, who I mentioned was the daughter of Rav Moshe Leib of Sasso, she was known also as a great righteous individual. She was considered a great Chassidic tzaddikus as well. And following her husband's passing, she would receive kvitlach. She would receive requests for prayer by the followers of her husband at the court. So she became something of a celebrity as well. He had two very impressive sons-in-law. One daughter, Shena Rachel, married Reb Yitzchak Friedman of Behush, a great Chassidic leader of the Rizhin dynasty, one of the oldest grandchildren of the Rizhiner, and founder of the Behush branch. And Behush, also in Romania, the same area. Behush was a very prominent Rizhin branch in Romania up and down to the war, and even after the war, the Behush Rebbe managed to make it to Israel and established himself in Tel Aviv. They were a more Zionistic Hasidic group. Today, the current Behush Rebbe has taken a ideologically a different path, but Behush is now much smaller, but they still exist. They're still around. There was another daughter of Rav Dovid of Zabeltov. Excuse me. Her name was Falia, and she married Falia. She married in her second marriage, following her first husband's passing. She married Reb Yosef Babad, who was the rabbi of the large city of Tarnopol, and he was the author of the acclaimed work, the Minchas Chinuch. Reb Yosef Babad, of course, was a Chassid, and in his first marriage, he had been the brother-in-law and the follower of the Divrei Chaim of Tzanz, Reb Chaim Halberstam of Tzanz. He was also a follower. Reb Yosef Babad was also a follower of Naftali Harwitz of Ropshitz, the Ropshitzer. So, in his second marriage, he marries a daughter of this Rav Dovid Hager of Zabeltov. So, back to Rav Dovid. When he passes away in 1848, he's succeeded by his son, Rav Yaakov Hager, who continues the Zabaltov dynasty. He actually had three other brothers who continued different branches in other towns. So again, it keeps on going out and branching out, and each one has their limited following. So it became quite prominent and influential in the Bukovina region, and Rav Yaakov was the leader of the Zabaltov dynasty until his passing in 1881, succeeded by his son, Rav Menachem Mendel Hager, who in turn was succeeded by his son, Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe was the rabbi of the town of Zabeltov in his father's lifetime. He was appointed already as the communal rabbi while his father was still alive. And he only succeeded him as a Chassidic leader on his passing. But he was already a known scholar and Paisik already earlier on in 1906 when he became the rabbi of the town. By this time, there was already a bit of a decline already in the Zabeltov court. There was so many other branches of the Hager Kossov dynasty by this time in the area that it got a bit too crowded. And Rav Menachem Mendel did not have many followers. And during World War I, Rav Menachem Mendel, Rav Moshe later on, did not have many followers. During World War I, he fled, Rav Moshe Hager fled to Vienna, as many other Rebbes did from the different districts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Galicia, Bukovina, Basarabia, etc., which had become the front lines. So many fled to the capital of Vienna, which is, again, a very interesting story, which I've mentioned other times in other episodes, but it's a very interesting story which has not been explored enough. A Western European capital, Vienna, which had never had a Hasidic population because the Hasidic movement had not moved, besides for the small community in the land of Israel, had not moved beyond the borders of Eastern Europe until the 20th century. It was only limited to Eastern Europe that whole time. And here, so Vienna never had a Hasidic population or any Rebbes residing there, and literally overnight became one of the most dense Hasidic cities in the world, probably second after Warsaw, with loads of Rebbes establishing courts there. It raises a lot of questions and is definitely a story to be told, so perhaps we'll have an opportunity to explore that on another occasion, especially since this is what would happen in New York City and Tel Aviv after World War II. So Vienna is somewhat of a model and foreshadows later events and should be studied to better understand the urban society of where Rebbes live today. So this Reb Moshe escapes to Vienna and passes away there during World War I. He's buried there in 1916, and his son Reb Chaim Hager succeeds him. And following World War I, unlike most other Rebbes in Vienna at that time, he returns to his hometown in 1920 and reestablished the Zabeltov court back home in Zabeltov, where most others remained in Vienna. So he gains renown as a great Torah scholar. In 1938, he visited Palestine, and he desired to settle there permanently. It did not work out, and he returned to Zabeltov. And during the Nazi occupation, he was beaten by the Nazis and then taken to forced labor to pave roads. And then later on, unfortunately, he and his wife and his 4 children were all killed by the Nazis in 1942, and no one survived from the family. If we take a step back and look at the extended family, through all the many branches of this Hager Kossov family, almost no one survives. For instance, the last Kossov Rebbe had the same name, but also he was a Reb Chaim Hager, and he and his entire family were wiped out in the Kolomaya ghetto, in Lvov, in the Belzhitz death camp, and at the same goes for most of the other smaller and lesser known branches. Each one was a Rebbe with followers, with a family, and almost all of them perished. And we grew up knowing about the famous Rebbes. We grew up knowing about the few who were able to escape and rebuild, and so on. But during the 9 days, perhaps it's the time to take a step back and confront the overwhelming destruction and to see how much was actually lost during that time. Of course, once a name is available, it doesn't go entirely into oblivion. That never happens. There's always someone who attempts to resurrect the name, and another descendant, I'm not even sure how he's related, but another descendant of Rav Dovid Hager of Zabeltov, who was the original founder, like I mentioned, someone by the name of Rabbi Zion Hager. He served as the Zabeltov Rebbe during the 1990s in the Arzei Habira neighborhood in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim. And upon his passing, his son, Rabbi Shaleb Hager, continues the remnant of the Zabeltov name by maintaining a shtibel in my city of residence in Beit Shemesh. So it's still around, at least in name, it is still around. So hopefully this will, be a springboard to other stories and future profiles, depending on what gets sponsored. And this is just a glimpse into the Kossov and then Vizhnitz and the lesser-known branches of that dynasty. There's Radovitz, there's Sarat Vizhnitz today, and definitely this can be expanded into a series. So hopefully we'll have the opportunity to do so. So this is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.